Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 59 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by Paula Whyman, author of the recently published book Bad Naturalist. Having been inspired by Isabella Tree's Knepp estate in the UK and Douglas Tallamy's Homegrown National Park movement in the US, Paula set out to find a small rural escape in the hope of establishing a wildflower meadow. However, Mother Nature had slightly bigger plans for Paula, and in 2020 she found herself face to face with the opportunity to become the guardian of 200 acres of impoverished and neglected Virginia mountaintop, where many invasive species were causing havoc to this precious, regionally important ecosystem. Despite being a self-confessed terrible gardener who knew nothing about plants, Paula has thrown herself heart and soul into her partnership with this mountain and the meadows and forests she now cares for and hopes to restore. With the advice and help of both locals and experts, she has already begun to tip the balance in favour of the numerous native plants that support the insects, birds and wildlife of the region. The lessons Paula quickly learnt are a great reminder to us all. There is not a single path or categorically right option to take. Everything requires a degree of trade-off. Expecting perfection becomes a fool's folly that simply leads to frustration. But if we slowly embrace nature's own timelines and make peace with tackling one challenge at a time and doing the best we can with the knowledge and information we have at this time, it is truly possible to make a difference in this world. Welcome, Paula, and thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I have just finished reading your latest book, The Bad Naturalist, and I'm really excited to talk to you because it's just a fantastic book, and we will highly recommend it to my listeners, and I'll have links for them to go and look and find out more information. But to get us started, I always just ask my guests to share a little bit about their nature story. So just, it can be anything you like, a fond memory of nature or how it sort of evolved. I know a lot of that's covered in your books. So it's just, if you can pick a little bit to get us started, that would be lovely.
Sure. Well, when I was a kid, I was really into bugs. And I guess I have to say I still am interested in insects. And I would sit under this tree in our backyard and turn over rocks and look for things. I would collect when the 17-year or the 7-year or the 5-year cicadas would come out. I would collect them and I would let them crawl on me and their feet were kind of sticky. I don't know if I still sort of remember that sensation, but I would collect them in one of those bug houses. And at one point I had collected about 100 of them. Yes. And then I would collect caterpillars, hoping that they would turn into butterflies while I watched. You know, I would sit there and stare at them and wait for them to turn into butterflies. And one thing led to another, and I became a kid who would, at the beach, I would find a horseshoe crab that had washed up on the beach, and I was sure it was supposed to be in the water, so I'd throw it back in the water, and then it would wash up again. And after that happened a few times, I took it to the bathtub in our hotel room and tried to give it a habitat there. And of course, that didn't go very well.
Oh, wow. You obviously had very understanding parents.
I did.
Oh, I love that. It's I think I love in your book, one of the things is I love how like everything has a character, like all of the plants and things you describe. And I think that obviously stems from like that early childhood, real like wonder and an immersion in nature that you clearly kind of enjoyed, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yes. There were times when I was further away from nature, of course, but I was always reading about it. I was always excited about something. I would always do these deep dives. So I spent a lot of time at one point kayaking in these mangrove swamps on the west coast of Florida. And at that time, I got really obsessed with mangrove trees, and I could tell the difference between the white, the red, and the black mangroves.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was like really focused on these little crabs that would wander around the roots of the mangrove and all the things about how they clean the water. And so I would periodically get sort of preoccupied with usually a creature, but sometimes it was a plant. And that led me to continually read about conservation and nature. And by the time I went to graduate school for my master's in writing, I got permission to do an independent study with the biology department, which was
Oh,
back then
wow.
kind of unusual.
Yeah.
And I worked on a project. I really wanted to be able to write more clearly about nature and science, even
Yeah.
in my fiction, since I was primarily writing fiction at the time. And I did a paper about gray whales.
Oh, wow.
And yes, and it was really exciting to me then later on to be able to use some of what I learned in my work. But I didn't do it right away necessarily. This is the
Been a
first,
journey.
yeah, this is the first full length nonfiction book I've written, and it's all nature and science and
Yeah.
memoir. So this was my
Yeah, it's
first chance. Yeah.
I think well most people won't have probably picked up your book yet because I think it's literally coming out it's the start of January and it's just coming out in the US there, and I think it's a bit of a delay for us in Europe to get our hands on it. But
Uh,
it's well it started with a dream, didn't it, of basically creating a meadow, and I think it was quite quite a sort of you know it morphed into quite a monster, didn't it? Really, sort of. I suppose it's one of those places where a place finds you. I think that was the sort of the feeling I got from it. Is like you didn't go out looking for the project that you bought, but it came along and sort of tapped you on the shoulder and said, I think we can have fun here."
that is such an apt characterization of it. Yes, that's exactly what happened because we were looking for a place in the country. We wanted to move out to the country to a small piece of farmland, and I wanted to raise sheep, and I wanted to plant a small meadow, a small emphasis on small, and what fix up a farmhouse and have the sheep and sit in a shed in the middle of this meadow and write my books
Yeah.
and watch the butterflies, like very romanticized image, right?
Yeah.
That's not exactly what happened. So I had this idea about the meadow, though, from reading about what was happening in conservation at the time. Rewilding was becoming very big, and I had read Isabella Tree's book
Yeah.
Wilding, and I was just captivated by the idea of what she had done, returning all of these acres to nature, like 3,000 plus acres. And I had also read a book called Nature's Best Hope by Doug
Oh,
Tallamy,
yes.
and he founded the Homegrown National Park movement, which is all about transforming parts of your lawn or all of your lawn from non-native grass into native plants to
Yeah.
feed pollinators and birds and so on. So I had both of these ideas like in my mind, and that's
Yeah.
like, I'm going to do my part by
Yeah.
planting a small meadow. And when it's a small, like maybe an acre,
Yeah.
or wherever, because we were looking at acreage, but not
Yeah.
huge acreage.
Yeah.
And then we came to this place, and we really just came up here to see the view, this mountain, because we
Yeah.
had heard it was fantastic. And it was August, and it was very, very hot and bright, and it's humid in August. And we there was no way to get up here, but everyone said, oh, it's worth it. You have to go up. And so we had to hike up because the road didn't go all the way through. It was rocks and roots, and it was a very steep road
Yeah.
because this is a small mountain, but it's still a mountain, and the road was like 20-degree grade. It was,
And it had
and
been abandoned as well, hadn't it, for a
well,
while as well. So
it hadn't been in use. Yeah, it had been a cattle farm for about 40 years or so,
okay.
but that had stopped at least 5 years before we saw it. And so it hadn't been mowed or hayed in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So when we walked up there, they had just mowed a little path so that we could walk through, and the vegetation was over our heads, over 6 feet tall, dense, green, and it was these yellow flowers everywhere, and bees everywhere. And we got up to the top of this high point and looked out, and it was unusual in that there was an open meadow, about 75 acres of open meadow,
Wow.
rolling hills, steep slopes, and yellow flowers as far as I could see.
Oh,
And I was like, well, I was thinking about this small meadow, and now here in front of me is this vast landscape, and my plans started to seem a little too small. So I thought, you know what could I do in a place like this?
yeah.
And I, completely disregarding the fact that I knew nothing about plants. I mean, there were no mangrove trees growing up here. I knew nothing about plants. I was a terrible gardener. I had no idea how to go about this, you know, encouraging native plants, whatever I was planning to
Yeah.
do there. I didn't know the questions to ask. I didn't know whom to ask. I knew nothing. And still, I was like, oh, yes,
Yeah.
I'm going to do this. This is going to be great. Oh, boy.
And what sort of timescale are we when did you first visit the mountain?
It was August of 2020,
Oh
which,
wow, so it's still quite a condensed sort of time frame that you've been there.
yes. And it was unfortunately early on in the pandemic.
Yeah.
We had started looking for a place quite a bit before that in earnest. And this was really a plan we had been talking about for decades. And we had just, we had looked off and on, but it was never the right time. And
Yeah.
so I'm glad we waited because this is a really special place.
Yeah, yeah, it was clearly it sort of feels like it was destined to be, and and it's certainly had its ups and downs, which you describe beautifully in your book. But it does feel like you were meant to be the custodian of this place, and that's something that really comes across in your book, and I think is quite important to you is this idea that whilst in paper and in our society you own it, you're more of a custodian. You see yourself as a guardian of it, don't you?
Yes, very much so. I think this is an endless project. It's going to be the work of the rest of my life. And if I don't take responsibility for it, it would really be a negative
Yeah.
for, I'm not just for this place itself, but really for the places downslope, for so many other places, because everything happens on top of a mountain, works its way down eventually.
Yeah.
And, animals carry seeds from here to there. Of course, they also carry seeds from there to here,
Yeah.
which is a problem.
Yeah.
But the more I can do to tip the balance here toward native plants, the better it'll be for the ecological community, for the natural community, in a larger sense. But even if I don't have an impact anywhere else, the impact here, for all of the creatures that need this place, it's been open like this for hundreds of years, which is very unusual. So these various communities have developed, and I'd like to maintain and improve it. And the only way I can do that is to actively manage it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, I mean, you talk a lot about sort of the history of people and plants and the land, not just in relation to your own property, but in relation to sort of invasive species across America as well. And it it does, we have been managing the land for better or worse for thousands and thousands of years, haven't we? And I think sometimes it is difficult to find that balance, isn't it? And I think you talk a lot about you get a lot of advice from experts, and a lot of it's conflicting advice, and you sort of have to, I guess, sit in the middle and weigh it up a little bit, don't you, as to what's the And you talk about how there's not one single solution. And I think that's something that's really important for people to learn when they start dealing with nature, isn't it? Is there isn't one way to do things.
Oh, that was one of the big things that I learned. I had no idea that in conservation there were going to be options. And no one would come and tell me, okay, this is what you do. First you do that, then you do that. And then, I mean, they did, there were plans created, but they weren't set in stone. It wasn't like this is absolutely going to work. And a conservation biologist might say one thing and a forester might say something else and an ornithologist might say something else. Like if you ask one expert, well, that vine on that tree is native, but it's awfully heavy. Should I leave it there or not? One of them will say yes, and the other one will say no, and they'll have very legitimate reasons for that. And then it's up to me to decide. It's very dependent on your goals.
Yeah.
So, what are my goals, and how do I want to get there? One of the big things was, will I use a lot of, what level of pesticide use am I
Yeah.
comfortable with? And when I say pesticides, I really mean herbicides. But
Yeah.
I was trying to minimize chemical use, and some people were telling me that if I didn't do X, I was not going to be able to be successful in meeting my goals.
Yeah.
And to their credit, they were trying to help me meet my goals.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but yeah. And even about mowing or bush hogging, which is when you have a big attachment on a tractor and you can deal with taller, denser vegetation.
Yeah.
Like in a meadow, you probably do want to mow it occasionally, or it's going to become a shrubland and a bramble and maybe eventually a forest. And I can say why I don't want that to happen in certain places, and because some people might say, well, why don't you just let it go into a forest? But people would tell me, don't mow at this time of year, but not at that time of year, or mow this much, but not that much. And I really had to, it took years for me to figure out what the right balance was.
Yeah.
And they weren't wrong. And it
Yeah.
wasn't a bad thing for me to have all of those different, all of those different pieces of advice. All of that input was helpful and helped me learn. And when bad things would happen, when I would do something that would have not the outcome that I wanted, at first I was upset, but eventually I was comforted knowing that this was normal
Yeah.
and that it happened to experts.
Yeah.
That it was a normal thing in conservation. Everything is sort of an experiment. And
Yeah.
this was another thing I really wasn't prepared for, the trade-offs that, no matter what I do, something else was probably going to either be harmed or fall by the wayside. And I had to decide how to handle that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really that's a really sort of strong message for people to get, because I think we do get caught up in this sort of idealism of like we're somehow going to create this like amazing paradise that's going to stay sort of static, I suppose, isn't it? And nature isn't like that. Nature's always changing and evolving, and certain species will predominate in one year and not so much in the next year. And you have to, it's a great lesson in humility, I think, isn't it? When you start, I think the history of gardening is one of like we were trying to control nature with like a sort of iron fist, weren't we? And it was, we'd use our chemicals and everything to just sort of like be like, no, we'll force our will on it. And I think more and more in conservation and rewilding, and I love your term restoration, is understanding that actually you kind of have to partner with nature a little bit, and it's gonna have its own ideas and agendas, and you might have best intentions, but it's gonna have other intentions, and you've you've got to accept that they might not be on the same path at the same time.
Someone told me, one of the experts told me along the way that one of the things you can count on is what you see is what you'll get.
Yeah.
So when you clear a field or, get rid of one thing, that thing is probably going to come back.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the one thing you can count on. And the unknown is what's in the soil, what's in the
Yeah.
seed bank waiting, because all of these annual plants have been dropping seeds, and those seeds can last for 7 years, sometimes more.
Yeah.
And they're going to keep coming up. So, so it's very much a game of history also.
Yeah.
What what happened to the land before, and what do you need to do to guide it in the way that, in the to move it in a direction. And so this land, like I said before, it was a cattle pasture, and before that was an apple orchard. This whole area was apple orchards, and for about 150
Oh,
years,
wow.
until apples, I suppose, became, I guess New York and the state of Washington got better at apples, and somehow
Okay.
Virginia lost out. And so
Yeah,
there
and
aren't
they
as
became
many.
economically unviable, I guess, in the area. They didn't support the economically they didn't support things as much as they had historically.
Yeah, so most of those apple orchards became cattle farms.
Yeah.
And that is, I suppose, what happened on this mountain. The previous owner had cut down the apple trees here, most of the apple trees here, and replaced with cattle. So when I came here, we had orchard grass left
Right.
from the apple orchards. We
Yeah.
had hay grasses,
Right.
pasture grasses, left from the cattle. We had invasive plants that had been brought in on vehicles or by animals or planted intentionally in some cases.
Yeah.
And we had the hardier native plants that could manage to grow amid the dense mat of
Yeah.
fescues and other
The ones
plants.
that are, clung on by their fingertips, like white knuckles, just like we're not leaving, we're hanging on to. Yeah.
So those were the things I could count on seeing. And from year to year, as you said, it changes. So a couple of years ago, I was concerned because we did have a lot of milkweed here. And monarch butterflies are an important species here and everything. So I was excited that we had a lot of milkweed. It was one of the major native plants we had. And it is an aggressive
Yeah.
plant. So it was able to survive here, along with things like goldenrod and yellow crownbeard, which was that yellow flower that I
It
saw
was
the
your
first
field
day.
of gold when you first arrived. Yeah.
Yeah. And then like a couple of years ago, I noticed that I wasn't seeing as much milkweed, and I couldn't figure out why. And I was sort of upset about it, and I didn't know what to do. But it turned out we hadn't bush hogged or mowed, if you want to
Okay.
think of that,
Yeah.
these fields in a while, and they had started to become too shrubby.
Okay.
And when they start to become too shrubby, it shades out some of those.
Sort of
Some,
meadow wildflower. Yeah.
exactly. So we we bush hogged the fields, not the whole field, but a, a section. And the following year, the milkweeds were back.
Oh. Yeah, it's
So
it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, nature is just incredible, and I think that's what comes across in your book is this journey with nature. But it's it's what's really interesting is I think, and you mention it in your book as well. You talk about the different landscapes. We think of forest, scrubland, and meadow, and the succession. And it was believed for a long time, wasn't it, that basically if you left any grassland, it would eventually become forest because that's what we'd sort of misinterpreted from the fossil banks because of tree pollen is fossilizes much more easily than grass pollen. So just we thought that there was forest everywhere and hadn't given the grasslands and the meadow is quite as much attention as we perhaps should have done. But meadows are really important because there are so many species that just are completely reliant on them, aren't there? And if we allow them to just follow that succession into forest, then obviously we're losing a lot of vital habitat for your native insects, animals, birds.
Yes, exactly. There's an organization here that is a collaboration among several nonprofits um, that is focused on bringing back grassland bird
Yeah.
species. The grassland birds are in steep decline,
Yeah.
and so that's one reason that I'm trying to do this because I would like to be able to attract more of those birds to this place. And we just got nest boxes for American kestrels here, and I was
Oh,
really excited
wow.
about that. I wrote about that in my newsletter, and this group is studying kestrels to see how many breeding pairs there are, how
Yeah.
many nestlings, and so on, and trying to figure out what's causing their decline, whether it's pesticides or development or combination, and so on. And so I'm hoping I'm going to see some kestrels here. But you were talking about, I just lost the thread of what you were saying before.
No, it's fine.
Something you
We were
said.
talking about how important meadows were basically, and I
Oh
think that
yeah,
they're a bit underestimated. And I think there's been so much focus on tree planting, and I think actually at one point you mentioned how you are going to plant a little bit. There's a slope that is sort of not doing great as meadow and would be benefit more from being trees, which you can maybe talk a bit. But the people that you have spoken with about that, they said there's loads of money and sort of opportunities available for planting trees. And I think I've seen that myself. Trees became their sort of like they're going to be our savior, as it were. And whilst it is hugely important to plant trees, it's also really important to recognize the ecological value of these amazing meadows and grasslands, and they need our attention, and they're actually valuable in carbon terms as well, aren't they?
yes, absolutely. Now we have obviously a big problem with forest fires, and when trees burn, that carbon that they've stored is returned to the atmosphere. But when grasslands burn or meadows burn, the carbon stays in the soil.
Yeah.
So that soil sequesters carbon. And I do want to mention because the idea that everything goes to closed canopy forest, a lot of the South in America used to be prairie.
Yeah.
When we think of the Midwest, we think of prairies. We don't necessarily think about it in the South, but a lot of the South was prairies. But when European agriculture came in and those methods and plowing and so on, the prairies were no longer able to grow. And here on the mountain, interestingly, at first I thought, oh, the mountaintop must have been timbered.
Yeah.
People came in, they needed firewood, they built buildings, they needed the wood, and then they cut it down for the orchards and so on. But apparently that's not exactly what happened. I'm sure that some of the area was timbered, absolutely. But a scientist I met with who came here and took a look around said that he thought it was very likely savanna,
Oh,
the
wow. Okay.
parts of this open area for
Yeah.
a very long time, way longer than a few hundred years. He said the rock outcroppings told him that, and the history of fire in the area. He said lightning induced fires would have burned the meadows just about every 5 years.
Yeah.
And that would have kept things from going into closed canopy
Yeah.
forest. Now, one reason that people think in the South that the forests belong there is because in bad times when farmers had to abandon their land because they'd changed the soil so drastically, those prairie plants didn't come back.
Yeah.
Instead, the area succeeded to forest.
Yeah.
So so people got used to seeing that forest and thinking that was the natural way it should be. But no, the prairie plants are very important. The creatures are very important for the whole ecosystem and the whole web and feeding birds. And if people need a reason that applies to us, a lot of those plants also feed pollinators that pollinate our food
Yeah.
plants.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. That's really, I mean, it comes all back to biodiversity, doesn't it? I mean, I'm sure in America, like we are here, it's becoming people are becoming much more aware of this biodiversity crisis that we're sort of facing, and I think that's why it's so important to be having this discussion about the importance of meadows as well. It's like they are this sort of like we're overlooked, and I loved there was one of the people who's I think become a friend of yours. I can't remember her name, but she said to you that plants are often overlooked. And I think you described a lovely scene where she does a TED talk and she shows a picture of a bird in a tree, and then it's like and asks people to describe it, and they just describe the bird completely oblivious to the tree in the picture. And I think that's the sad thing about plants, isn't it? Is I think people we do overlook them. I think it's sort of even people who are interested in nature, like quite often their first interest will be animals or birds, and it's only like as you sort of I mean it's our own succession, isn't it? Almost we as we go along the journey in the path a bit more, we start sort of noticing the plants actually and things like that, and it is really important that we have these native plants because that's what supports all of the whole life cycle of the pollinators and the insects, which then the birds and the mammals and everything else needs. And that's what's so amazing about what you're doing is you're trying to literally sort of put the foundation blocks of the native plants back in control of these areas so that nature can help do the rest with the pollinators and the birds and everything else.
Yes, and I was totally guilty of that sort of plant blindness myself until I came to this project, really. I mean, every now and then a specific plant would get my attention, but otherwise it was like a backdrop.
Yeah.
Like in a Hollywood movie where they had those painted backdrops with the westerns, going
Yeah.
on horseback in front of them. And eventually I learned to see the plants,
Yeah.
and it was very rewarding because you're right, it is so important. We can't have the wildlife we love without the plants.
Yeah.
And it just what really amazed me actually when I started looking at invasive plants and why they were so successful was the ingenuity of these plants and the number of ways they developed to reproduce and to defeat, or get around their predators.
Well,
It was
you've got to share a
fascinating to
bit
me.
about your what is it, the tree of heaven, which is probably
Oh
the
yeah.
most like inappropriately named. But I loved that chapter, and it left me like I was like absolutely amazed because I had no idea that this it's really that sort of day of the Triffids kind of species, isn't it?
Oh yes, and it may have actually been, no, I think it was earlier than that, when I first encountered that tree's diabolical abilities when I was wandering through this field that we had recently cut. So everything was about 8 inches tall. And I literally tripped over this sapling that was maybe this tall, and it was cut. And I was like, what's that? I wonder what that is. And then I looked ahead of me and there was another one and another one and another. There was literally a row as if someone had planted them right all the way to the woods across this field. And I had no idea what they were. And then one of the experts came out and pointed out a grove of trees and said, you need to get rid of these. This is the tree of heaven. It's going to take over your meadow. And there was a mother tree, a very large tree, and around it, all of these little, maybe 10 feet tall, saplings, and that all looked identical. Which is a little creepy. And they had grown up out of the roots of the tree.
Wow.
And those cut saplings I saw in the field were suckers, they're called. The tree had sent out these shoots from 50 feet away. That's why I didn't
Wow.
associate it
Yeah.
at all with
Yeah.
that grove of trees, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that, you couldn't just cut it down. That would be too easy. You had to treat it, and you couldn't, like, there's a treatment that you can do with some trees called cut stump treatment, where you cut it down and then you brush
Yeah.
the stump with pesticide, and that takes care of it. You cannot do that with the tree of heaven, because that is a signal. As soon as it gets cut, it sends out all of these new, not to mention the seeds. It creates so many seeds, and it's apparently its ability to be a prolific seeder through its entire lifespan is also unusual. Like, even when it's old, it can put out almost the same number of seeds, and the viability,
Yeah.
the percentage of seeds that will actually grow is way high. I forget if it was like 70%. It was like way higher than most trees. So it has all these different ways of reproducing. And you have to, so the most effective way to get rid of it is something called hack and squirt, where I know it sounds a little, but you take a little hatchet or something, then you cut a little wedge, and then
Around the trunk. Yeah.
yeah, but you can't go all the way around, because if you girdle it, then that tells it to send out all those shoots. You have to do a few wedges separated in a circle, and then you put a little bit of herbicide in those wedges, and you have to do it at the right time. If you do it in the spring, it's all just going to flow back out. So you have to wait later for when it's drawing in nutrients.
Yeah.
And then you might have to do it a couple of times, especially if it's a big tree. So it was such a process. And also,
Have you beaten your tree yet though? That's the question.
that grove of trees is dead.
Okay.
That grove of trees, but there are more.
Yeah.
There are more. There are 200 acres here. There are Ailanthus, or tree of heavens. Their scientific name is Ailanthus. They're particularly at the edges of the woods, because what they like to do is, as soon as there's a sunny spot,
Okay.
they jump in and grow really fast and take over. And we have these native ash trees here that have been attacked by the emerald ash borer,
Oh
which
no.
is an
Okay.
invasive insect.
Yeah.
And those trees are dying. And when they die, they fall and they leave a
Create a
gap.
lovely light spot. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
The
and
sort of perfect storm. I think this is the thing. I mean, I found it fascinating reading the book. I mean, I had no idea that I mean, it's incredible, really, is it? I mean, we have to give its dues. I mean, it's literally like if survival of the fittest, it's like going to win a gold medal. And but it's important, and it sometimes feels very hard, I think, to feel like you've actually got to kill and destroy something, doesn't it? It feels kind of counterintuitive. People that, we care about nature, we're about creating but it's understanding that actually these trees they're not native to the US. I think they're from Asia originally, aren't they? And they were brought in by many years, hundreds of years ago, and they've
in the
just
late 1700s, they were brought in during the the plant trade craze
yeah
at that time, and a lot of these invasives, not all of them, but a good number of them were brought in that way, and they became garden escapees. They're
yeah
very successful, and so when people say, "Well, it's okay if I just planted this one,"
yeah 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 no, and
um,
it's really sad because they don't have any natural sort of controls because they're not in their native habitat, so there aren't native pests and things that would cause them to die back. So they've kind of got this natural advantage over everything else around them, and so you can end up with them literally crowding everything out, can't you? And that's why you have to make this difficult call to actually say, okay, actually in this place at this time, you're actually more damaging than you are helping.
Yes, exactly. And that was something that I had a lot of trouble with because I don't like killing things.
Yeah,
And the idea of killing trees
yeah,
was particularly because you're supposed to plant trees.
yeah,
And I had no idea that there were trees that were undesirable until I started this project. And what you said about the predators was is really key because that's why they developed all of these different ways of reproducing was to get around the predators and still be able to survive in their natural habitat. And their predators don't usually travel with them.
yeah,
Well, in this case, the spotted lanternfly did eventually show up here, and the tree of heaven is the host tree for this invasive insect, which is now wreaking havoc in this area. And but there were no predators, so we have to be the predator,
yeah,
I guess is what it comes down to. But it was a difficult thing. And then I would at times just get so frustrated and angry and tired of waiting for something to happen or seeing so many of these trees and feeling helpless about it and
yeah,
just I would just be like, okay, I'm going to do this myself. And I'm just going to do this.
yeah.
But there's certain things I really can't and shouldn't do myself.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? I think that really came across in your journey that there were times when I kind of sensed that it felt like overwhelming and you were, just losing the battle as it were and just were like, am I actually just making things worse? And I think it's difficult as well, isn't it? Because we have certain timescales in our society that we think we work along, and then nature has a completely different timeline that it works along, and it's quite difficult, isn't it? But how did you sort of overcome that sense of actually I guess almost losing your hope for for the whole thing at certain points?
I guess I mean, it took a while for me to understand that it was not going to be an even, balanced, smooth timeline,
Yeah,
that there were going to be ups and downs, that it was going to be one step forward, two steps back in various ways. And that was just normal.
yeah,
So the more I talked with people and heard about their projects, and the more I talked with experts, the more I felt like, okay, if I don't let it go, I'm going to be constantly frustrated and upset just because I would, spend a day pulling the 3 foot tall stilt grass over here, and then the garlic mustard would grow up over there.
yeah,
And I can't pull the garlic mustard yet because it's the wrong time of year. So it would just, I mean, that's inevitable, especially with this many acres, that I can't do everything and be everywhere, and I have to prioritize, pick the worst spots to work on. Or one thing I try to do is pick the places where I see something new coming in that's
yeah,
bad, that I
yeah,
try to control that so it doesn't get out of hand in a new place. So I have that going on with an invasive vine right now that I've seen it in a couple of new places, but I can't really do anything about it this time of year. I'm hoping to burn it. I'm waiting to find out if I'll get a prescribed burn this winter. And if so, that will help take care of it because then when it grows up, I'll be able to see it growing back and I'll be
yeah.
able to pull it as it comes up. But when it's surrounded by blackberry bramble and other dense vegetation, I can't see it until it's
So big
tall.
that
And
it's out of control.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I had this vision. I don't know if if you had the same game as children at school as a youngster, but we used to call it grandmother's footsteps, and it was like you'd have one person at the front and a row of people like a distance behind them, and the person at the front would like sort of look away, and then they'd have to turn around, and the people behind had to try and sneak closer when the person at the front wasn't looking, and if you managed to sneak up, you won. And I sort of I sort of viewed you as like, you know, the grandmother at the front, and then all the plants like, when you're not looking, try to creep closer to you in the background. But yeah, it sort of feels like that's kind of a metaphor for all of us that kind of care about the environment as well, is that like we kind of get to this place of like it feels like there's so much bombarding us. Like there's, you know, we've all got the sort of, you know, the metaphorical mile a minute vine in one side and the tree of heaven on the other, and we're like, oh, where do we put our focus? And we just sort of, you know, we can get really just weighed down by it and kind of almost paralyzed, I guess, don't you? You kind of get to that point where you're like, what's the point? Can I actually make a difference? And I think that's what's so lovely about your journey, is it's kind of reaffirming that we all feel like that, and it's kind of perfectly normal, but actually you can still do something, and you just have to do what's manageable and focus on the little bit at a time and not feel overwhelmed.
Exactly. I had to come to terms with the idea that I wasn't going to be able to do a perfect job, that there was no such thing as perfect
Yeah.
in ecological restoration or in conservation in general. It was all trade-offs
Yeah.
and making choices, and something was going to fall by the wayside, at least temporarily. So yes, starting small and focusing on one thing that you can feel successful about is so helpful, because it buoys you up, you know, and you can go on to the next thing. And I think that's great, a great approach for anyone, no matter what size property. If you have a window box in the city, or if you have your garden in your yard, I think starting small and focusing on the thing that matters to you, because then you'll become more engaged with it. I think that's a really good way to start.
So I mean, your journey has been over sort of 4 or 5 years now with the meadow. How do you feel it's going overall? Do you feel like you have incrementally moved towards your goals and your aspirations for the place, or are you still, you know, still lots of battles ahead?
Well, probably both.
Yeah.
I feel like I have accomplished things here. I have um, been able to see a couple of fields improve over time with the things that I'm doing. I have planted some trees in a riparian area to try to clean that water and
Yeah.
prevent erosion. I have planted trees on a slope that was hard to maintain as meadow, and those are fruit and nut trees, you know, native fruit and nut trees that I'm hoping will feed wildlife. And at the same time, um, I'm still, you know, I still get frustrated and I still get overwhelmed. And like maybe about a month ago, I had uh, a grove of Jimson weed
Okay.
that had that had sprung up on a hillside, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to wait till the next rain, and after it rains, I'm going to pull it all. And I was out there for a few hours. I pulled it all. It smells really bad, by the way, when the roots smell really bad. And I put it in these big, like 35-gallon contractor bags. And then I couldn't move the bags,
Oh no.
lift them. So I ended up, I wrote about this in my newsletter actually, but I ended up like leaving them on the hillside and letting them solarize,
Yeah.
so that basically the plants would die
Yeah.
inside and then they would be lighter and I'd be able to
Yeah.
move them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that was like, because I tend to sort of get started on something and get so into it that I may forget that that last step could be difficult. But I felt a sense of accomplishment there, and I think that was
Yeah.
important. Okay, I stopped that from spreading. Yes, I'm sure there are seeds in the soil. Yes, I'm sure they're going to grow back, but I've got it under control now. That one thing. And that's one thing that won't get out of hand in this one place. And that is in some ways the best I can do is to focus on something that I can make work. And I will say that I wasn't sure at times whether I was making enough progress. And recently, one of the experts who had been out here 3 or 4 years ago
Okay.
from an organization that's part of the Smithsonian Institute, an organization called Virginia Working Landscapes. They had done a survey very early on before
Oh,
I
wow.
started any of this for bird and plant species
Okay.
on the mountain. So I had sort of a short list of what was
Yeah,
happening
sort of
here.
baseline when you first arrived. Yeah.
Yeah. So she came back to take a walk here, and she said she was amazed. She thought
Oh,
it looked
wow.
so much better, and I'd done so much work, and it was really improved, and all of this. And I was like, really?
Hallelujah.
Okay, great. Because,
Yeah.
when you see something every day, when you see
Yeah.
something all the time, it's sometimes hard to
You
notice.
can't see the wood for the trees, as they say. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I was really glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's something that comes across in your book as well, is that like although you and your husband, your partner are there and you own it, but you have this community of people that you draw on their expertise, their advice, their help even. And that's so important, isn't it, as well, is not trying to just literally do it all on your own, but actually going out there and using the resources that are available to you.
Absolutely. It was absolutely key that I was able to talk with all of these experts in different fields, everyone from foresters to farmers to arborists to ornithologists and botanists, scientists who specialize in grasslands. It was really just, the agricultural extension
Yeah.
office. Just everybody was so generous with advice,
Yeah.
and um, often they would come out and walk the mountaintop with me, and most people want to do that. they're,
Yeah.
they're,
Yeah.
and I love taking walks here with people. So
Yeah.
it was really really an education for me. I mean, that was how I started learning about what I had here and what was happening here. And I also, in that way, learned to observe more effectively and
Yeah.
to pay more effective attention. And still, there are things I don't notice. I was down, there's a slope that I call the sledding hill. And I was down at the bottom of the sledding hill with my two kids they're in their 20s. They're not kids anymore, but it's a place that I walk occasionally, and they noticed something that, despite the number of times I'd been there, I had never noticed a particular tree that was growing out of another tree.
Oh, wow.
And and they wanted to know what kind of tree it was, and I didn't know, and we did all
Yeah.
this research. But it was so funny because it was next to this rock that I always go and stand on, and I hadn't noticed. I
Oh,
was looking at the moss on the rock. I was really into that.
yes. Oh, I know there's a whole section in your book about lichens, isn't there? And it's like, oh, amazing. Just didn't you on one you had someone come out and on one rock you found like what was it 30 different species just on one rocky escarpment on the property, which is amazing. And yeah.
Yes, I would like to know more about lichens. I just never realized. I thought a lichen was a lichen. I didn't know there were thousands of different species of lichen. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it is just I think that's the thing, isn't it? As you start to dive into it, you realize like actually like how little you know, but you have to take that as it's actually quite exciting and you can have this whole lifetime of just discovering new things and learning new things and actually isn't that an amazing way to live life?
It really is. It really feels like I'm never going to run out of things to discover here, and that's very exciting to me. All the little interconnections among the creatures and the plants, and the native plants and native insects and wildlife evolve together.
Yeah.
So they work together in these ways that I, I still don't. I'm still not totally aware of, and every time I find something out about that, it's very exciting.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm excited about continuing to learn new things. And one of the things about starting a project like this at my age is that I could have made life easier for myself, and sometimes I ask when I'm very frustrated, I ask myself why I didn't have to start something that would be a complete 100% learning curve.
Yeah.
Um, and yet I'm glad that I did because it's almost like having a second life,
Yeah.
I did this
Yeah.
one thing for so many years and now I'm doing this other thing and I'm learning a completely new world.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
Oh, it's
Exciting.
I yeah, it's I would well, I hope everyone's going to go out and read your book and you mentioned your newsletter as well. So is that if people go to your website, can they sign up to your newsletter there?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And it's free and it's monthly. And I usually include a lot of photos and talk about what I'm finding on the mountain. And there's always also a photo of my standard poodle.
Oh, fun. Even better. No, it's lovely because I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is it's like I mean, it's like Isabella Tree's book Wilding as well. Is it's a snapshot of your journey so far, but your journey isn't over. And I think if anyone is like me and has read the book and enjoyed it and you want to you kind of feel invested. I feel a little invested in the mountain and I want to know like how it's going and it's and all the characters and the people that have helped you. And I think one of the things I really loved was your relationship with it's Adams, isn't it, who's a local farmer. And I know in this country sometimes the farming community and the rewilding community can sort of rub each other up the wrong way a little bit and can be feel threatened by each other, I suppose. And I think you've come to a quite a nice relationship with him where you both respect each other's goals of what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve and also sort of help each other out as well, don't you?
Yes, he was yes, he's funny because I would ask him about bush hogging a field and he'd always say, I might cut a little more than you asked me to. Because he was really in the beginning really horrified with the idea that I wanted more milkweed and crownbeard and less hay grasses.
Yeah.
He's like, these are good hay grasses. You're going to destroy this. It's already getting
Yeah.
overgrown by all this stuff. I mean, it was before I got here,
Yeah.
frankly, but yeah, it took him a while to understand that my goals were different. I don't have cattle, he has 300 cattle and he can't have milkweed in his
Yeah.
field. And it took me a while to understand that too.
Yeah.
And we sort of joke with each other about it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, he's been a huge help when he's not scaring me about tool use and the terrible things that can happen. Like when I finally got a pair of snake-proof boots, I sent him a note and I said, I got my boots. And he was like, now don't go sitting down in that meadow. Because we do have venomous snakes here. We have rattlesnakes and copperheads, and he always says he sees a lot of rattlesnakes when he's here in the meadow, and I haven't seen the rattlesnakes. I have seen other snakes. I've seen
Yeah.
non-venomous snakes, but apparently they are here, and the rodents are enough to occupy them in the meadow, and that's fine,
Yeah.
fine with me. But there are times when I need to walk out there, and it's much better to have some protection.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And Um, yeah, it's just I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is like some, the native plants. I know one that you talk about is it the black cherry? And
Mm.
for cattle and humans as well, it's quite toxic, but it's amazing for caterpillars and has a very important role in the ecosystem. So yeah, it is in balance, isn't it? And having respect for everything and just finding a way to try and live alongside the native species that are beneficial and should be there, even if they're venomous and need to be given a wide berth.
Yes, exactly. And it's sort of like voles. I know that voles are the bane of many gardeners, and they eat the tree roots and they girdle young trees and so on. But in a meadow, they're actually very important as long as you can keep them away from your vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is it's relearning the importance of all of these species in this kind of entangled, interconnected web of life that we're in. And I think as gardeners, we've perhaps created a rather long legacy of, sort of hatred towards native species. And it's exciting now to see that narrative is really changing, and there is all of these movements led by incredible people like the Homegrown National Park. We have an amazing lady in Ireland as well, who has she calls it "We Are the Ark," and
Oh.
her ideas are the same sort of thing as well, of just basically anyone who's got any land or space or even a window box to just plant natives and encourage that kind of natural ecosystem that should be there in your environment. And I did a lovely podcast a while ago with the National Wildlife Federation, and they have some amazing resources for people who are trying to find what should be native in their area as well. Because in America, it's you're you're huge in terms of scale compared to us in the UK, and actually there's a huge difference of what's native for you in Virginia on your mountainside to other areas of America, isn't there? So it's important to find the natives for your environment and ecosystem.
Yes, you want the native plants that are attuned to your region because they'll also grow better.
Yeah.
They'll here, this is a rocky, dry, highly erodible mountaintop, and the native plants that grow here are well adapted to drought um, versus the non-native plants, and they don't require fertilizer or anything like that, you don't have to feed them. You don't
Yeah.
have to water them. They just will grow. Now,
Yeah.
some of our native plants here, I believe, are invasive in the UK. I think
Yeah. And
milkweed isn't it invasive there?
yeah,
And
yeah. And it would be vice versa as well, isn't it? Like, some of
mhm.
the things that I'm sure
Spotted knapweed.
yeah.
That is one of my nemeses.
Yeah, whereas knapweeds here are completely, well, certain species of them are native here, and we would be encouraging them. So it's important to seek out those experts and that information and help yourself as much as you can to get started. But it's been absolutely amazing talking to you, Paula. I feel like we could probably talk for hours, but I'm conscious that we probably need to wrap up. So, is there anything you would like to leave people with? I will make sure all your links are there so that they can find your newsletter and hopefully get your book and learn more about your amazing journey on your incredible mountain. But is there anything you'd like to just leave people with today?
Well, thank you so much. I guess I would just say, please visit my website, which is paulawhyman.com, and that's Wyman with an H, WHY, like why man.
Yeah.
And and you can find my events there and my social links. And I also am always happy to hear from readers. I love talking with book clubs. If anyone wants me, I can do that remotely. And yeah, so send me a note through my contact page if you have questions or comments about my book or my newsletter or just want to ask me something. I love hearing from readers.
Oh, that's amazing. And I think there was one quote that you read that you put in quite near the end of your book, which I just like to share with people. And it was by a lady called Judith Schwartz, I think is that how you say her
Hmm.
name? And she said, efforts to restore biodiversity are as much about imagination as anything else. We need imagination in order to have hope, and we need hope in order to act. And I just think that that's just a beautiful quote that jumped out at me. And I think, as a writer, you're clearly not short of imagination, and you brought that through into your hope. And you've given us all hope as we've watched your journey and we see what is possible. And hopefully it inspires many more people to go out there and do what they can, whether that's in, a small backyard in the suburbs, or they have fortunate enough to have a couple of acres or even hundreds of acres, that actually we can all make a difference. And just, yeah, go out and do what you can.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that would be the one thing, like I was saying earlier, pick something small, start small, whatever you're drawn to, because that's what you'll stay engaged with, and that'll spark curiosity. And when your curiosity is sparked, I think that leads to inspiration and action, just like you were saying.
Oh, well, lovely. Thank you so much, Paula. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.